Silas Crow didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of the land registry office, dropped a thick envelope onto the clerk's desk, and said 4 words that would destroy 2 lives before sundown. File it, all of it. Inside that envelope was a deed forged, dated 3 years back, claiming every acre of the Holloway Ranch, including the ashes, belonged to the Crow Land Syndicate. He didn't know yet about the woman who had just stepped off the stagecoach. He didn't know about her letters, her stubbornness, or what she was carrying in the leather case chained to her wrist. If he had known, he might have moved faster. But Silas Crow was the kind of man who assumed he had already won before the game began. He was wrong. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with us. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments. What city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The stagecoach had been 4 days from Denver, and Rosalie Mercer had stopped apologizing for taking up space somewhere around the Colorado border. She was a big woman. She knew it. The other passengers knew it. The man pressed against the window to her left had made his feelings clear through 17 hours of theatrical sighing, and she had eventually stopped noticing him the way you stop noticing a dripping faucet. Still there, just not worth your attention anymore. What she was paying attention to was the letter folded in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the creases had gone soft. Dear Miss Mercer, I won't pretend the ranch is much to look at right now, but I believe in honest correspondence, and so I'm telling you plainly. The land is good, the work is real, and I am a man who keeps his word. Ethan Holloway had written that. A rancher in Dry Creek, Wyoming, who had answered her advertisement in the matrimonial news with no flowery promises and no flattery, which was precisely why she had written him back. She was 34 years old. She had buried her mother in February, settled the estate by March, and placed her advertisement in April. Not because she was desperate. She'd been clear about that with herself during the long evenings in her mother's house in Boston, sitting with tea gone cold and a ledger open on the table, but because she was finished waiting for life to arrive at her door. Life didn't come to you, you went to it. The stagecoach lurched, and the man against the window made a sound like a cat being stepped on. Rosalie didn't flinch. She was watching the landscape instead, how it had changed from the green softness of the east into something older and more serious. The Wyoming sky was enormous. She had not expected that. She had read about the frontier in newspapers and thought she understood it. She did not understand it. It was like reading about the ocean and then standing at its edge for the first time and realizing words had lied to you, not through dishonesty, but through simple failure. Some things couldn't be described. They had to be stood in front of. When the stagecoach finally rolled into Dry Creek, it was mid-afternoon, and the first thing Rosalie smelled was smoke. Not cook-fire smoke, not chimney smoke, old smoke, the kind that had soaked into the ground and stayed. She stepped down from the coach, leather travel case in her left hand, the small one, the locked one, and her larger trunk was being wrestled off the back by the driver, who was ignoring it with the focused dedication of a man who believed luggage moved itself if you waited long enough. "Excuse me," she said to a woman standing near the post office. "I'm looking for the Holloway Ranch. Could you point me in the right direction?" The woman looked at her, then looked at the case, then looked at her face again with an expression that managed to combine pity and judgment into something that felt almost like a slap. "You're the mail-order bride," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Rosalie Mercer," she said. "I correspond with Ethan Holloway. Is the ranch far from here?" The woman's expression shifted. Something complicated moved across her face. "Honey," she said, and stopped. "What?" "The Holloway Ranch burned 6 weeks ago. Every building on it. The barn, the house, all of it. They said it started in the western pasture during a dry lightning storm, but the wind—" She stopped again. "There's nothing left out there, just the land and what's left standing after." Rosalie stood still. The driver dropped her trunk onto the dirt behind her with a thud she felt in her back teeth, and then he was climbing back up onto his seat, and the horses were already moving before she had taken her next breath. "And Ethan Holloway?" she said. "Alive," the woman said, and said it like it was the complicated part. "Burns on his hands and one side of his face. He's been living in what used to be a storage shed at the north edge of his property. People have offered to help. He doesn't take it." Rosalie looked down at the trunk. She looked at the street. She looked at the woman. How far is the property from here? About 2 miles, but miss— Thank you, Rosalie said, and picked up her trunk handle. She had not gone 10 steps before 3 different people had stopped to stare. She kept walking. Her boots were good Boston leather and completely wrong for this road, and she could feel every rock through the thin sole, and she kept walking. She had not written Ethan Holloway 47 letters to turn around at the edge of town. She found him exactly where the woman had said she would. The storage shed was more substantial than she'd imagined. It had 4 walls and a roof that didn't look actively hostile, but it was not a home. There was a fire ring outside it, a water barrel, a pair of leather gloves hanging off a nail that had been driven into the exterior wall with more force than was necessary. Ethan Holloway was standing at the water barrel with his back to her. She had seen the drawing he'd sent with his 3rd letter. A rough sketch, he'd apologized, because he didn't have a photograph to spare. The drawing had shown a man who looked like he'd been assembled outdoors, somewhere between a fence post and a mountain. She had liked it more than a formal portrait would have told her, because a man who sent a rough sketch instead of pretending was a man who didn't pretend. But the man at the water barrel was not what she had prepared herself for. His shirt was pushed up to the elbows. She could see from here that his left forearm was scarred, not healed, over time scarred, but recently healed, still red and pulled and angry looking. When he heard her footsteps and turned, she saw that one side of his face, the right side, jaw to temple, carried the same marks. The skin there had been rebuilt by the fire into something that wasn't quite his face anymore. It was close, but it wasn't the same. He stared at her. She set her trunk down. "I'm Rosalie Mercer," she said. "I've come a long way." Something moved across Ethan Holloway's face that she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't welcome, it wasn't anger, it was something closer to pain, the kind that comes from something you thought you'd managed to put away, jumping back up when you least expected it. "You need to get back on the next stagecoach," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd imagined from his letters. Not unkind, just worn down. "The next stagecoach doesn't come through until Thursday," she said. "Then wait in town." "I've been sitting in a coach for 4 days, Mr. Holloway. I'm not interested in waiting in town." He looked at her trunk. He looked at the case in her hand. He looked at her face. "You see this?" He gestured at the shed, at the bare land behind it, at the darkness in the eastern field that was, even from here, recognizable as Char. "There's nothing here. I can't offer you what I said I could in those letters. The house is gone. The barn is gone. Half my cattle died in the fire, and I sold the other half to cover debts. I have a shed and 40 acres of burned ground, and I cannot in good conscience ask you to—" "You're not asking," she said. "I'm telling you I'm staying." He made a sound she couldn't quite categorize, not a laugh, not quite. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I've been managing accounts since I was 16 years old. I know what 40 acres looks like in a ledger, and I know what labor can turn damaged ground into if it's applied consistently." She paused. "I also know that you wrote me honest letters for 8 months when most men would have written me flattery, and I respect that more than you understand right now." Ethan Holloway put his hands on his hips. She noticed how careful he was with the left hand, how he kept it angled slightly away from his body. And he looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was, underneath the damage and the exhaustion, trying very hard to figure out what she actually was. 40 acres of burned ground," he said again. "I heard you the first time." A beat of silence. "There's no house." "I see that. That shed has 1 room. Then we'll build 2. He looked away. His jaw worked. She watched him fight something internal, pride probably, or the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that accepting help is the same as admitting defeat. And she waited, because she had learned patience the hard way, through years of being the woman in the room that no one expected to know what she was talking about. "You're not what I expected," he finally said. "No," she agreed. "I suspect I'm not." The town of Dry Creek had opinions about Rosalie Mercer from the moment she walked back through it, carrying her own trunk and asking the general store owner, a man named Fletcher, if she could purchase a cot and a set of basic tools on credit until she'd gotten settled. Fletcher had looked at her, looked at the note she'd written, looked at her again. "You're staying at the Holloway property," he said. It sounded like he wanted to ask something else. "I am," she said. "That's—" He stopped, reconsidered. "That's a good 10 minutes of walking." I walked it once already today. I imagine I'll get faster. She did not get credit on that first visit. Fletcher was not a mean man, but he was a cautious one, and caution in a small frontier town often dressed itself up as principle. He told her he'd need to see some proof of means before extending credit to a stranger. She thanked him, took her $2.40, bought a handsaw, a box of nails, and a bar of soap, and walked the 10 minutes back to the burned ranch with her purchases in a burlap sack over her shoulder. Ethan had not moved far from where she'd left him. He was sitting on an upturned crate near the fire ring, and he was doing nothing, which she suspected was not his natural state, and was instead a symptom of a man who had lost the thing that usually gave his days their shape. She set the burlap sack down beside him. "I'm going to need your help with one end of the first beam," she said. "I can manage most of the framing myself if you show me how you want it oriented, but I'll need a second pair of hands for the heavy pieces." He looked at the sack, looked at her. "You bought a handsaw." "I did." "You know how to use it?" "I'll learn." He looked at her for a long moment. The scarred side of his face caught the late afternoon light and held it, and she met his eyes without looking away from it, because she had decided the first moment she'd seen him that she was not going to treat it like something to be looked around. He reached over and picked up the handsaw, turned it in his good hand. "The teeth need to face forward," he said, "on the pull stroke. People always get that wrong." "Show me," she said. It was the first thing he'd offered her since she'd arrived. She took it as a beginning. Oh. That evening, the gossip in Dry Creek reached a pitch that Rosalie could almost feel from 2 miles away, which was a talent she'd developed in Boston society rooms and refined in the 3 months after her mother's death, when everyone had opinions about what she should do, and none of those opinions involved asking her what she wanted. She had heard, secondhand through the woman at the post office, whose name turned out to be Martha, and who was, beneath the initial judgment, a person of genuine curiosity, that the consensus in town was roughly as follows. The mail-order bride from Boston was either dangerously naive, mentally unbalanced, or chasing something she hadn't disclosed, because no sensible woman would stay at a burned ranch with a man who'd told her plainly to leave. The third theory had some truth in it, actually. She was chasing something. She'd been chasing it for years. She wanted to be somewhere that needed her, not in the way that a sick person needs a nurse, not in the way that an empty room needs furniture. She wanted to be in a place that would have stayed lesser without her, that would have failed, maybe, if she hadn't shown up and refused to be moved. She'd had wealth her whole life, her mother's family, the inheritance she hadn't yet disclosed to anyone in Wyoming. Money was, in her experience, the least interesting thing about a situation. Money was simply a tool, and a tool was only as good as the problem it was applied to. The problem in front of her was 40 acres of burned ground, a man held together by scar tissue and stubbornness, and a shed with one room. She'd worked with less. Ethan didn't sleep well. He hadn't since the fire, which was 6 weeks ago and felt like 6 years. He'd lie down on his bedroll in the corner of the shed, and the darkness would smell wrong. Not like smoke anymore, but like the absence of the smells that used to be there. The absence of pine from the barn walls. The absence of the particular mix of hay and leather and horse that had been the first thing he'd smelled every morning for 11 years. He was not a man who expressed things easily. He was aware of this. His father had been the same way. All practicality and hard work, and an almost physical discomfort with the act of articulating feelings as if they were facts. Ethan had grown up understanding that what you built was more honest than what you said, and that a man's worth was in what he'd made with his own hands. His hands were damaged now, the left one especially. He could close it into a fist, but not all the way. The burn had taken something from the tendons. He didn't fully understand the medical explanation the doctor in Cheyenne had given him, but he understood the result, which was that he couldn't grip the way he used to, couldn't apply the same leverage, couldn't swing a hammer with the same force that had built the barn he'd lost. He lay in the dark that night and listened to the woman he hadn't expected on the other side of the single curtain he'd strung up to give her privacy, and he thought about what she'd said. "I've been managing accounts since I was 16 years old." She said it like it was unremarkable, like it was just a fact about herself, the same way you'd say you knew how to ride a horse. He'd grown up around women who were capable, frontier women had to be, but there was something specific about the way Rosalie Mercer spoke about competence that was different. She didn't seem to need him to validate it. She was simply telling him what tools she had available. the same way a carpenter might tell a client which saws he owned. He thought about the letters. Her letters had been, he searched for the word, direct. She'd written him about what she wanted and what she expected and what she was not willing to tolerate, and there had been no performance in any of it. He'd written her back more honestly than he'd intended, probably because honest letters received tend to generate honest letters in return. He had not written her about the fire. He had not been able to find the words. Then the fire had written itself. He heard her turn over on the cot. It creaked, not badly, but it creaked. And then it was quiet again, and outside the shed the Wyoming night was doing what Wyoming nights do, which is to say it was enormous and cold and entirely indifferent to what any particular human being happened to be going through. He thought, she came all this way? He thought, she saw the burns and she didn't look away. He thought, I told her to leave and she bought a handsaw. It didn't solve anything. She was still in a shed on burned ground, and he was still a man with a scarred face and a damaged hand and 40 useless acres, and in the morning none of that would have changed. But something else had changed, in the quiet way that important things sometimes shift. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but the way the first frozen ground of a hard winter eventually starts to loosen when spring finally decides to mean it. He didn't sleep, but for the first time in 6 weeks, the darkness didn't feel quite as total as it had. By the end of the first week, they had a system that neither of them had formally agreed to, but that had assembled itself out of necessity and a shared understanding that nothing was going to happen on this land without sustained effort from both of them. Rosalie rose before dawn. She'd always been an early riser. Her mother had called it her most useful quality and her most annoying one, often in the same breath. She made coffee over the fire ring outside, which she'd taught herself to do on the second morning after her first attempt had produced something that Ethan had drunk without comment, which she recognized as the frontier equivalent of a polite lie. By the third morning she'd figured it out, and he'd said better, which she understood to be high praise. Ethan was always already awake when she came out. She never knew when he actually slept, or if he did. He'd be at the edge of the burned field with his coffee, looking at it, the way a doctor might look at a patient he wasn't sure he could save but wasn't ready to give up on. Westfield first, he said on the morning of the 5th day. The soil underneath the burn layer is still good. I can tell by the color. We clear the ash, we can test it. I'll need the numbers, she said, acre by acre. What were your yields before the fire? He looked at her. You want to do a crop analysis? I want to know what we're working with, she said. You can't rebuild something if you don't know what it was. He was quiet for a moment. I kept a ledger. In the house. He paused. It burned. Then we start from what you remember. He remembered more than she expected. He had a rancher's memory for numbers. Not formal, not organized the way her mother's accountant had been, but precise in the way that comes from years of caring deeply about particular things. He knew yield per acre. He knew what the cattle had weighed and what they'd sold for. He knew the water table depth and the angle of the slope, and which parts of the land held moisture and which drained too fast. She listened and she wrote it all down, sitting on the upturned crate with a new ledger she'd bought at Fletcher's. And when she was done, she looked at what she'd written and said, "This is workable." "Say that again," he said, and there was something in his voice she'd not heard before, something that was maybe the early precursor to hope, still held back, still suspicious of itself. "It's workable," she said. "It's going to be hard. But the land is good, Ethan. The land didn't go anywhere." He looked at the black field. He said very quietly, "I know." She didn't push it further. Some things needed to be sat with before they could become action. She'd learned that from her mother, who had been sick for a long time before she died, and who had understood that some kinds of grief needed to be given their proper time and not rushed toward usefulness before they were ready. She looked down at the ledger. She thought about the leather case under her cot, with its lock and its contents and its secret that she'd been carrying since Boston, and she thought about whether this was the moment to say something about it. She decided it wasn't, not yet. There would be a right time for that particular truth. She had learned, the hard way, what happened when wealth arrived before trust did, and she was not going to make that mistake again. She closed the ledger. "Westfield," she said, "after breakfast." "After breakfast," he agreed. They went to work. The Westfield did not cooperate. Rosalie had expected hard work. She had not quite expected this particular quality of hardness, which was less like climbing a steep hill and more like pushing against something that had no intention of moving and no awareness that you were pushing. The ash layer was deeper than it had looked from the shed. In some places, it went down 8 inches before the soil changed color, and the soil underneath, while good, Ethan had been right about that, was compacted from weeks of rain that had followed the fire, sealing the surface into something close to clay. She found this out on the first morning by trying to drive a post into the ground with a mallet and watching the post refuse to go more than 3 inches before stopping completely. Ethan, watching from 6 feet away, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You need to break the crust first, before the post. Otherwise, you're just hammering against the problem." "Show me." He took the iron bar from against the shed wall. She hadn't known what it was for when she'd seen it, and drove it into the ground once, twice, 3 times in a tight circle around where she'd been working. Then he handed it back to her and stepped away. She tried the post again. It went in clean. "Thank you," she said. He said, which she had already learned was his version of "you're welcome." That was how it went in those first 2 weeks. He did not offer instruction unless she asked, or unless he saw her about to waste an hour on something that had a simpler solution. She did not ask for more than she needed. Between them, they had developed an unspoken vocabulary of efficiency, which was not the same as comfort, but was a kind of respect. And on a burned ranch in Wyoming, respect was a more useful currency than comfort anyway. By the end of the second week, they had cleared the first acre of the west field and broken the crust on another half. Rosalie's hands had gone from sore to blistered to something past blistered that had not yet found its proper name. She wrapped them in strips cut from an old shirt and kept working. She did not mention her hands to Ethan. He had seen them. He had not said anything, which she chose to interpret as acknowledgement rather than indifference. What she did not know was that he'd gone to Fletcher's general store on Thursday evening when she was doing accounts at the fire ring and spent 42 cents on a tin of salve that the druggist said was good for raw skin. He'd set it on the corner of the crate she used as a desk without explanation. She'd found it the next morning, looked at it for a moment, and put it to use without comment. Neither of them mentioned it. This was not coldness. It was something closer to the opposite. Martha, the woman from the post office, came by on a Saturday with bread and a jar of beans that she set down near the fire ring and then stood with her hands folded, looking at the partially cleared field with an expression that mixed surprise with something she was trying not to show. "You've done more than I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Rosalie asked. She was not being sharp. She genuinely wanted to know. Martha considered this with the honesty of a woman who'd learned that lying was more trouble than it was worth. "I expected you'd be gone by Tuesday," she said. "Most people, no offense meant, but most people come out here and see what it is, and they make a calculation." "And what's the calculation?" "Whether what they came for is worth what it's going to cost them." She glanced at Ethan, who was on the far side of the field and well out of earshot, dragging a section of charred fence rail toward the pile they'd been building at the eastern edge. "He's not an easy man." "No," Rosalie agreed. "He's not. But you're still here." "I'm still here." Martha looked at her for a moment with something that had shifted past the initial judgment from the first day and was now closer to genuine curiosity, maybe even the early stages of respect. "Is there anything else you need? Anything I can actually help with, not just gossip about from a distance?" "Information," Rosalie said, "about the land office. Who runs it, how the claim records work, who's been filing on properties in the county recently." Martha's expression changed slightly. "Why?" "I like to know the lay of things," Rosalie said simply. "It's a habit." Martha looked at her a moment longer. "The land office is run by a man named Orrin Webb. He's been there 12 years. He's decent, mostly. But the filings—" She stopped. "What?" "There have been a few things lately that people have noticed. New claims on properties that people thought were settled. A couple of the older homesteaders got letters saying their titles needed to be re-verified. Most of them just signed what they were told to sign. They didn't know any better." Rosalie went still. She kept her expression neutral. She was good at this. She'd learned it in boardrooms where being the only woman meant that any visible reaction was immediately used as evidence of either incompetence or emotion. She had learned to keep her face quiet and let her mind do its work. "Who's been filing those new claims?" she asked. "A land broker," Martha said. Came to town about 2 months ago. Name of Crow. Rosalie wrote the name in her memory the way you'd write it in ink. Permanent, not to be misplaced. Thank you, she said. The bread is wonderful. Martha left, and Rosalie stood at the fire ring for a moment after, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about a name and what it might mean and the timing of it. A man arriving 2 months ago, the fire 6 weeks ago, and the particular coincidence of a land broker in a town where the biggest landowner had just lost everything. She did not believe in coincidence. She went back to work. The argument, when it came over the roof. They had started rebuilding the house at the beginning of the 3rd week. Not the original house. That foundation was cracked and would need to be redone properly, which was a later problem. What they were building was something smaller, something that could be done with 2 people, and a limited supply of lumber that Rosalie had negotiated out of a mill 30 miles east, paid for with a portion of her traveling money that she'd presented to Ethan as credit extended against future earnings, which was true in the narrow sense that she was the one who would eventually be earning the money that repaid the debt, just not in the way he understood. The roof was the problem. The pitch she'd calculated would hold against winter snow load. She'd spent an evening doing the arithmetic on it, checking it twice, was steeper than Ethan thought was necessary. You're overcounting the snow, he said. We don't get the accumulation up here that you're thinking. This isn't Denver. I know it's not Denver. I adjusted for elevation and average January precipitation. She showed him the paper. If we go with your pitch, and we get a wet winter, we're going to run out of lumber before we close the east wall. She stopped. She looked at the lumber stack. She looked at the paper. She ran the numbers again in her head, which took about 4 seconds, and the numbers said the same thing they'd said the first time, which was that he was right, and she was going to have to adjust. The east wall closes first, she said. Then we assess what's left and adjust the pitch if we need to. I've been saying that. I know, she said. I was just getting there. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the nearest thing to one she'd heard from him. It lasted maybe half a second, and then it was gone, and he was already moving toward the wall framing, but she had caught it, and she put it away carefully, the way you'd put away something that might be rare. She went to the other end of the east wall, and they worked in silence for a while. And the silence was a different quality than it had been in the first week. The first week's silence had been the silence of 2 people who did not know each other, which is really just the absence of conversation. This silence was something that had been built, like the wall they were working on, piece by piece, out of shared effort and small understandings. It wasn't easy. She didn't want to pretend it was easy. There were moments, late afternoon, when she was tired in a way that was deeper than muscles, when she thought about the leather case under her cot, about what was in it, about what it would change if she said something. She could end the lumber problem with a telegram to her bank in Boston. She could end the credit problem at Fletcher's. She could end, if she chose, every material difficulty that was currently making this rebuilding so grinding and slow. But she knew she had learned this the hard way, specifically in the person of a man named Frederick Holloway Ainsworth, which was a long story that she did not let herself think about on workdays because it served no useful purpose. She knew that wealth introduced too early into a relationship built on the pretense of shared poverty was corrosive. People changed when they found out. Not always badly, but they changed. And something about the change was irreversible, because once a person knew what you had, they could never entirely stop seeing it when they looked at you, even if they tried. She wanted Ethan Holloway to see her first, just her, the work and her. So she kept quiet about the leather case, and she kept adjusting, and she let the days be hard. The day Fletcher changed his mind about the credit was the day he'd watched Rosalie Mercer walk into his store with a handwritten list, $7.14 in exact change, and a calm explanation of exactly why each item on the list represented a necessary investment in the productive capacity of the Holloway Ranch, including a projected return timeline that she'd laid out in 4 sentences that were so precisely organized he'd found himself nodding before he'd decided to. "You were an accountant?" he asked. "I managed accounts," she said. "Among other things." "For who?" She smiled, not the performative kind, just the kind that acknowledged a question without fully answering it. "People who had things that needed managing." He extended the credit. She thanked him with the specific warmth she reserved for people who came around and didn't make a production of it. Walking back, supplies in a cart she'd borrowed from Martha, she passed the land office. The window was dusty. Through it she could see a clerk at a desk, and in the back corner a man in a gray coat sitting across from Orrin Webb with a leather satchel open on the table between them. She didn't stop walking, but she looked. The man in the gray coat had his back to the window. She couldn't see his face. What she could see was the particular way he sat, leaning forward slightly, one hand flat on the table near the open satchel, the posture of a man who was not asking for something but presenting the terms of something already decided. She walked on, but she thought about him all the way back to the ranch. Ethan noticed the change in her at dinner, which was still eaten outside at the fire ring, which neither of them had suggested changing, even as the house walls went up, because there was something about the fire ring that had become theirs in a way the unfinished house wasn't yet. He noticed that she was quieter than usual, which was saying something, because she wasn't a woman who filled silence with sound. But there were different kinds of quiet. This one had a direction to it. "What is it?" he said. She looked up from the tin plate. "I saw someone at the land office today, when I was coming back from Fletcher's." "And?" "And I don't know yet. I might be wrong about it." He set down his fork. "Rosalie, what did you see?" She told him about the man in the gray coat, about Martha's mention of the land broker named Crow, about the letters that had gone to homesteaders asking them to re-verify their titles. She laid it out in the same organized way she laid everything out. Not dramatically, just clearly, one thing after another, and letting the shape of it speak for itself. When she finished, Ethan was looking at the fire. "The fire," he said. "I don't know," she said again. "I genuinely don't know. Fires happen. Lightning storms happen. I'm not saying—" "The fire started in the far western corner of my property," he said. His voice had gone flat in a way she hadn't heard before. Controlled. "I've thought about it. The way a fire moves in a dry wind, it should have started from the east and moved west. But it didn't. It started in the west and moved east. I asked the ranch hand who saw the smoke first. He said the same thing. West corner, no lightning, clear sky that morning. The fire ring snapped, a log shifted. You never said anything, she said. I didn't have proof. I still don't. And a man with a burned ranch and a ruined face making accusations without proof it's just noise. Nobody listens to that kind of noise. It gets you dismissed, and once you're dismissed, you lose whatever chance you had. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this for 6 weeks. I've been thinking about it since the morning after, he said. I just couldn't do anything about it alone. The word alone sat between them for a moment. It didn't need anything added to it. Tell me who owned the properties adjacent to yours before you bought this land, she said. He told her. She listened. She asked 3 more questions, and his answers to those 3 questions told her something she filed away carefully because it fit with what Martha had said, and it fit with the man in the gray coat, and it was beginning to fit together into a shape she recognized, not from frontier experience, which she didn't have, but from the Boston financial world, where the same instincts operated in tailored coats and paneled offices instead of leather satchels and land registries. The mechanism was different. The method was the same. Find a target that can't easily defend itself. Apply pressure. Wait for collapse. Move in. Ethan, she said, are there any other ranchers in the county who've had trouble recently? Not fires necessarily, just trouble. Legal questions about their titles, sudden debt pressure, that kind of thing. He thought about it. Caldwell family, north of here. They had a boundary dispute come up out of nowhere last spring. Before that, the Petersons sold and left. I heard it was debt, but the Petersons had been here 20 years. They weren't the kind to fold over debt. He paused. And there's Walt Briggs. Has about 200 acres east of town. Last month he told me a lawyer had come to him saying his original title filing had an error that needed correcting. Did he correct it? He was going to. Last time I spoke to him. She put her plate down and picked up the ledger she kept near the fire ring and wrote down 4 names. Caldwell, Peterson, Briggs, Holloway. She stared at the list. We need to talk to Walt Briggs, she said, before he signs anything. Rosalie, I know I might be wrong, she said. I'm asking you to help me find out. He looked at her across the fire. On the scarred side of his face, the flames moved in the damaged skin in a way that was unfamiliar And also, she had come to think, not as hard to look at as she'd initially had to remind herself. It was just his face. It was what the fire had made of it. She had stopped noticing it as wrong somewhere in the middle of the second week, somewhere around the morning when he'd shown her how to read a soil color, and had leaned in close to point at the ground, and she'd been thinking entirely about the soil. "You think this is bigger than my ranch," he said. "I think it might be," she said. "I think someone is working down a list and your name was on it, and maybe the fire was how they decided to move things along when the other methods were taking too long." He was quiet for a moment. "And if you're right, then going after them means they'll come after us," she said. "Yes, I know that." She met his eyes without blinking. "Still want to?" she asked. He picked up his fork. "I'll go see Walt Briggs in the morning." She nodded. They went back to eating. The fire burned down to red coals, and the Wyoming night pressed in from all sides, enormous and indifferent, and neither of them said anything more about it, because the decision had been made and there was nothing left to add. Walt Briggs was a compact, weathered man in his late 50s who looked at Rosalie with the particular cautious assessment of a person who had been burned recently, not literally, the way Ethan had, but in the financial sense, by trust extended to the wrong people. He sat across from them at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and the expression of a man who had not been sleeping well. "The lawyer's name was Hatch," he said. "Edmund Hatch. Came from Cheyenne. Showed me a document saying there was an error in the original filing from 1871. Said the survey marks were off by 12 degrees, and that meant my eastern boundary wasn't legally established." "Do you still have the original filing?" Rosalie asked. "Somewhere. I'd have to look." "Look," she said. "Tonight, if you can. Don't sign anything until I've seen both documents." Walt looked at her, then at Ethan. "Who is she?" "She's my partner," Ethan said, and the word came out without hesitation in a way that surprised both of them slightly, though neither showed it. "She a lawyer?" "No," Rosalie said, "but I've worked with enough lawyers to know which documents say what they're supposed to say, and which ones have been written to look like they say something they don't. I'd like to see what this Hatch gave you." Walt looked at her for a long moment, with the evaluating look of a man deciding whether to trust someone new after the wrong kind of trust had cost him. Then he pushed back from the table and went to the back room. He came back with a wooden box. Inside it were papers going back years, folded and slightly damp-smelling, the records of a life built document by document on frontier land. He spread them out and Rosalie leaned forward. She found what she was looking for in 4 minutes. The original filing, dated 1871, had a survey notation in the margin in a specific handwriting style. The cramped, backward slanting hand of a surveyor who used a particular shorthand she recognized from similar documents she'd handled in Boston in connection with her mother's estate. The survey marks were clear. The eastern boundary was exactly where Walt said it was. The document Hatch had given him, the one claiming the error, referenced the same filing but described different coordinates. Not slightly different, specifically different, in a direction that would reduce Walt's eastern acreage by approximately 30 acres and shift his boundary in a way that would leave a convenient corridor of unowned land between his property and the next. "It's not an error," she said. "The error is in what Hatch gave you." Walt stared at her. "Are you saying he forged—" "I'm saying the coordinates in the document Hatch gave you don't match the coordinates in your original filing, and I'm saying your original filing is the one that was notarized and recorded in 1871 by a county official, and I'm saying that has legal weight that a letter from a Cheyenne lawyer does not." She paused. "I'm also saying you should not sign anything this man brings you, and that if he comes back, you should ask for his license number and the name of the bar association he's registered with, and you should write them down in front of him." "Why?" "Because men who are doing what I think Hatch is doing don't like being written down," she said. "They prefer the people they're working on to feel like private individuals with a private problem. The moment you treat it like a matter of public record, the air changes." Walt sat back. He looked at Ethan. "She's something," he said. "Yes," Ethan said. "She is." She did not react to this. But she felt it, somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum, a small and involuntary warmth that she did not examine too closely because she had learned the risks of premature examination. She looked back at the documents. "Walt." Are there other families in the county who've had visits like this? He named 4 more. 2 of them were names she didn't have. She added them to the list in her head. 6 families. Possibly more she hadn't heard about yet. And Ethan's ranch, which hadn't gotten a lawyer with a forged document. It had gotten a fire. She folded her hands on the table and thought about the man in the gray coat at the land office, leaning forward with one hand flat on the satchel, and she thought about the word Ethan had used last night, alone, and about the fact that they weren't that anymore, and about the fact that whatever was coming, it was going to come at them with more force than a forged boundary dispute. She thought about the leather case under her cot. She thought about what it contained and what it could do, and what it would cost them, in a different currency than money, if she used it wrong. She thought, not yet, but soon. Thank you, Walt, she said, and began carefully refolding his documents in the order she'd found them. What? The person who complicated everything, as people who complicate everything always do, arrived without announcement. His name was Silas Crow, and Rosalie had still not seen his face when he stepped out of the land office on a Tuesday afternoon and nearly walked into her on the boardwalk. She had been coming from the post office. He had been coming from the land office. For 2 or 3 seconds, they were simply 2 people who had nearly collided on a narrow piece of wooden walkway, and he stepped aside with the particular smooth apology of a man for whom charm was a professional tool, practiced, available on short notice, deployed without warmth. My apologies, ma'am, he said. I was not what she'd expected. She had built, in her mind, the image of a certain kind of man, rough edges, acquisitive hunger worn openly. Silas Crow was the opposite. He was well dressed in a way that was calibrated precisely to the frontier, not the expensive clothes of an Eastern businessman, which would have been immediately alienating, but good fabric, practical cut, just enough quality to suggest means without announcing them. He had a pleasant face. He was probably 45, had an easy smile, and wore the expression of a man with nothing particular on his conscience. She had learned, in Boston, to be more afraid of men who looked like nothing particular was on their conscience than of men who looked guilty. Not at all, she said. Are you new to Dry Creek? I don't think we've been introduced. The question was a test. She knew who he was. She wanted to see if he'd tell her. Silas Crow, he said, and extended his hand, which she shook. His grip was firm and brief and told her nothing. I'm in land acquisition. And you are? Rosalie Mercer, she said. I'm out at the Holloway Ranch. Something happened in his eyes. Not much. Barely a flicker. And gone before it fully formed. But she caught it. Ah, he said. Ethan Holloway's place. Our place, she said pleasantly. The flicker again. Controlled immediately. Of course, he said. Well, Miss Mercer, it's a pleasure. I hope you're finding the county to your liking. Very much so, she said. Dry Creek has a great deal to offer, I think. More than people realize, maybe. She smiled. Or at least, more than some people would prefer. She said it the way you'd say a perfectly ordinary thing. Then she excused herself and continued down the boardwalk. She did not look back, but she counted her steps, and she was steady all the way to the end of the block. And then she turned the corner and put her hand flat against the wall of the general store and stood there for 30 seconds while her heart did what hearts do when you've just looked directly at something dangerous and decided not to let it see that you're afraid. 30 seconds. Then she straightened up, took her hand off the wall, and walked to the post office to collect the mail. There was a letter waiting for her. Not from anyone in Wyoming, from her bank in Boston. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket without opening it, because the post office had thin walls, and she'd lived long enough to know that information was most valuable when it was held quietly. She walked back to the ranch with a steady pace and the particular alertness of a woman who understood, now that the game had been joined, and that the other side had been playing it for much longer than she had. The question was not whether she could win. The question was what winning was going to cost. She touched the pocket where the letter from Boston sat, crisp and unopened, and thought about timing, and about the leather case, and about a man with a pleasant face and nothing visible on his conscience. She had been afraid of men like that before. She had been right to be afraid. She had also learned, from those experiences, something that Silas Crow did not yet know about her, and would not see coming until it was too late to adjust for it. She did not get afraid and run. She got afraid and got organized. She walked through the gate of the Holloway Ranch, Their ranch, in the late afternoon light, with the unfinished house walls throwing long shadows across the ground they'd cleared together, and she looked at the progress they'd made with the particular eye of someone who had learned to measure distance from the starting point rather than from the destination. They had come a long way from ashes. They had further to go. She went inside to read her letter. The letter from Boston was 3 pages long, written in the precise hand of Edmund Hale, who had managed the Mercer estate accounts for 11 years and who communicated financial information with the emotional register of a man describing weather patterns, thorough, accurate, and entirely without drama, which Rosalie had always found to be his most valuable quality. She read it twice by lamplight, sitting on her cot with the leather case on the floor beside her and the curtain drawn, and when she was done, she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the wall of the shed and thought about the particular weight of a decision she had been postponing for 6 weeks. The letter confirmed what she already knew. The Mercer estate had been fully settled. The accounts were in order. The investments her mother had made in the decade before her death had performed well. Better than well, honestly, in a way that still sometimes surprised Rosalie when she saw the numbers written out in Edmund's level hand. The total figure was not the kind of number that you said out loud in a Wyoming shed on burned ground without it changing the air in the room permanently. She put the letter in the leather case and locked it. Then she sat with her wrapped hands in her lap and thought about Silas Crow's face on the boardwalk. The controlled flicker when she'd said our place. The way his charm had not reached his eyes, not even for a second, because charm as a professional tool doesn't need to reach the eyes. It only needs to reach the other person's perception of safety, and he had clearly decided that a woman coming off a stagecoach to a burned ranch was not a person whose perception of safety he needed to worry about. He had made his calculation wrong. She understood now that he already knew about the money. She didn't know how, but the flicker had told her. Not the word Holloway, but the word Mercer, the tiny recalibration behind his eyes when she'd given him her name. He'd already heard it. He'd already placed it, which meant someone had told him, which meant her arrival in Dry Creek had not gone as unnoticed as she'd allowed herself to hope, which meant the timeline she'd given herself, build trust first, disclose later, had just compressed without her permission. She needed to tell Ethan. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. She pulled back the curtain. Ethan was at the fire ring, which had burned down to coals. I was doing what he did in the evenings when he thought she wasn't watching, sitting with his damaged left hand resting open on his knee, looking at it with the particular expression of a man taking an honest inventory of something he'd rather not have to think about. She sat down on the other crate without announcing herself because she'd learned he didn't startle easily, and she said, "I need to tell you something." He didn't look up right away. "I had a feeling," he said. "You had a feeling about what specifically?" "That there was something you hadn't said yet." He looked up. "You go quiet in a particular way when you're deciding whether to say a thing." She looked at him. "I do?" "You do." She hadn't known that. She found it mildly alarming because she had thought she was better at concealment than that. And the fact that he had read her without her realizing it was both unsettling and, underneath the unsettling part, something warmer that she also didn't examine too closely. "I have money," she said. The fire coals popped. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved through the dry grass and was gone. "How much money?" he said. It wasn't a question so much as a request for the rest of the sentence. She told him. Not the exact figure, that wasn't the point, and she had learned that exact figures had a way of becoming the entire conversation, but enough. The Mercer estate, her mother's family, the investments, the leather case and what it contained. She watched his face while she talked. He didn't interrupt. He sat very still with his left hand still open on his knee and his right hand around his coffee cup and his eyes on her. And she watched the stillness carefully because she had done this before, told men about the money, and the stillness was always the moment before whatever came next, and whatever came next told you most of what you needed to know. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you known you were going to tell me?" "Since this afternoon," she said, "on the boardwalk." Crow. "He knew my name," she said, "not just Holloway. Mercer. He placed it, Ethan. Someone told him I was coming and who I was, and I don't know who or how, but the fact that he knows means the timeline has changed." Ethan set down the coffee cup. He stood up, which he rarely did when he was processing something. He was a man who thought best when he was still, and he walked to the edge of the cleared field and stood there with his back to her for a moment. She waited. She was good at waiting. Most people underestimated what waiting could accomplish if you did it without filling it with noise. "You came here knowing you had all of this," he said, still facing the field. "Yes." "And you didn't say?" "No." "Why?" She had thought about how to answer this. She had several true answers, and the truest one was also the most exposing, and she had not yet decided whether to say it. Then she thought about the flicker in Silas Crow's eyes and made her decision. "Because I wanted to know if you would see me," she said. "I have had experiences with men who found out about the money and couldn't see past it afterward. It changes the way people look at you. I wanted a few weeks where you looked at me without that." He turned around. She met his eyes across the firelight. "Did it work?" she asked. He came back and sat down on the crate and was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding something, wrestling with something, actually, in the particular way of a man who has a set of beliefs about pride and self-sufficiency and what it means to accept help, and who is trying to determine whether those beliefs are principles or whether they are just habits he's been calling principles. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "That's an honest answer." "I know," she said. "I'll take it." He picked up his coffee. "How much of what we've been doing out here, the ledger, the lumber calculation, the way you've been managing the supplies, how much of that would have been different if you'd just used the money from the start?" "The work would have been easier," she said. "We'd have a full house by now instead of walls. We'd have cattle. We'd have help." But you would have been working for me instead of with me," she said. "And that would have been a different thing, from the beginning." He looked at her for a long time. The scarred side of his face was toward the coals, and the light moved in the reconstructed skin, and she looked at it without looking away, which by now was simply what she did. "I need a day," he said. "Take 2, she said. "But Ethan, not more than 2, because whatever Crow is planning, it's moving, and I need you with me on this." "I know," he said. She nodded. She picked up her own cup, found it empty, and set it back down. "There's something else," she said. "Of course there is." "The fire," she said. "I think Crow ordered it." Ethan went completely still. "I think that's why he knew about me," she continued. "I think someone in the land registry, or near it, saw your mail, or someone along the stagecoach route. The Matrimonial News is a public publication. If someone was looking for leverage, looking for a reason a man with a burned ranch might be reachable, a woman coming from Boston with the Mercer. AIM isn't invisible to someone who knows what they're looking for." "He burned my ranch," Ethan said. His voice was flat, the kind of flat that is made by pressing very hard on something to keep it from moving. "I believe so," she said. "I don't have proof. We need proof before we do anything." "And when we have proof?" "When we have proof," she said, "we take it somewhere it can't be ignored, not to Orrin Webb at the land office. Somewhere with actual authority." Ethan looked at the coals. "My father built that barn," he said. "Took him 3 summers." She didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say to that. It was not a statement that needed a response. It needed what she gave it, which was silence and presence and the decision not to look away. After a while he said, "I'll need that day." "I know," she said. She went inside. She lay down on her cot in the dark and listened to him sit at the fire ring for a long time. And she thought about what she had just handed him and about the price of honesty, which was not that it cost you nothing, it cost you something, but that it cost you less than the alternative, eventually, always, in the end. He came to her on the second morning, not the second day, early, before she'd finished her coffee, when the sun was still low and the light was the particular gold that only happened for about 20 minutes before it became the ordinary white of a workday. He sat down across from her at the fire ring and said, "Tell me what you need me to do." That was all. No speech about pride, no negotiated conditions, just the question, direct, in the voice she'd come to know as his real one, the one underneath the worn-down surface. She had already made a list. The first thing on the list was a man named Thomas Greer. Thomas Greer was an attorney based in Laramie, which was 4 hours by horse, and he had a reputation in the county that Rosalie had assembled from 3 conversations with Martha, one with Walt Briggs, and one with a retired circuit judge named Calloway, who had come through Dry Creek on unrelated business, and whom Rosalie had sat next to at the lunch counter and spoken to for 45 minutes with the focused attention she reserved for people who knew things she needed. The retired judge had said Thomas Greer was honest, which in this context was not a small thing. He was also stubborn, cheap about his own fees, and personally offended by fraudulent land claims in a way that went beyond professional interest into something closer to a private opening. The judge had not given details about the 1879 case, but the way he'd said it suggested that it had cost Greer something personal, which in Rosalie's experience meant he would not walk away from a fight that reminded him of it. She wrote him a letter that evening, 4 pages, detailed, precise, with dates and names and a description of the documents she'd seen at Walt Briggs's table, the discrepancy in the survey coordinates, the pattern of homesteaders who'd received legal pressure in the previous 2 months, and her own encounter with Silas Crow on the boardwalk. She did not mention the Mercer estate in the letter. Ethan watched her write it. He was sitting against the shed wall with his arms crossed and his left hand tucked slightly. She'd noticed he did this when he was paying close attention to something, as if the hand required management when the rest of him was focused elsewhere. "You're not telling him about the money," he said. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because the case we're building needs to stand on what Crow did," she said, without looking up. "Not on what we have. If Greer takes this because there's money behind it, he might take it for the wrong reasons. I want him to take it because it's a legitimate case." "And if he says it isn't?" She looked up. "Then he's wrong, and I'll tell him so, and then I'll figure out another approach. But I don't think he'll say that." She sealed the letter and gave it to Ethan to take to the post office in the morning, because she had a reason not to go to town herself that day, which she explained and which Ethan accepted with a nod that meant he'd understood without needing it repeated. The reason was Walt Briggs. She needed to go back to him before he did anything irreversible with the document Edmund Hatch had given him. She walked the 2 miles to the Briggs property in the early morning while Ethan rode to town, and she found Walt in his yard with the expression of a man who had been visited again. "Hatch came back," he said. Her stomach dropped 1 precise inch. "When?" "Yesterday afternoon. He said the filing deadline was next week. Said if I didn't have the corrected title recorded by Friday, there'd be a lien on the property." Walt's voice was steady, but his hands weren't, and she noticed that and knew what it cost a man of his kind to show it. "He had another document, new one, said it superseded the original." "Do you still have it?" "Inside." She went inside and looked at the new document. It was more sophisticated than the first. Whoever was drafting these had learned from the earlier versions, tightened the language, added a notary seal that looked legitimate at first glance. The notary's name was stamped in the lower right corner, S. Dillard, Cheyenne. She wrote the name down. She also found the discrepancy, though it took her 7 minutes instead of 4, which told her the forgery was getting better and would eventually reach a quality level where she'd need someone with more specific legal expertise to distinguish it. That was exactly why Greer needed to move quickly. "Walt," she said, "listen to me very carefully. You're going to write Hatch a letter today. You're going to tell him that you've engaged a Laramie attorney to review all documents related to your title and that you will not be signing or recording anything until that review is complete. Use those words exactly." He's going to push back. "I know. Let him. He can push all he wants against a letter. What he can't do is force your signature, and as long as your signature isn't on anything, your title is intact." Walt looked at her. "And your lawyer in Laramie? He's actually coming?" "He will be," she said, with the specific confidence of a woman who hadn't yet heard back from Greer, but who had written a letter that she believed could not be reasonably declined. She walked back to the ranch. Halfway there, the sky opened up with the sudden violence that Wyoming summer storms were apparently capable of, and she was soaked through by the time she got through the gate, and she stood in the yard with water running off her coat brim and thought that the letter was in the mail and Greer would get it in 2 days, and either he'd come or he wouldn't. And if he wouldn't, she'd think of something else. She always thought of something else. It was possibly her most tiresome quality, she had been told, and she had long ago decided to take it as a compliment. Greer's response arrived in 4 days, not the 2 she'd hoped for, which cost her a particular quality of sleep during those extra 2 nights that she did not admit to anyone. His letter was half a page. He had read hers twice, he said. He was coming on Thursday. He had a case already assembled on coordinated land fraud in 3 counties that he had been struggling to connect to a central figure, and the name Crow had come up in that case 18 months ago and gone cold, and he would very much like to discuss what she had observed. She read the letter standing at the fire ring, and then read it again, and then set it down on the crate and breathed out slowly through her nose. Ethan was watching her from the east wall of the house, where he'd been laying the window frame. He'd gotten good at the framing work, better than she'd expected given his left hand, because he'd adapted his grip in ways she suspected had cost him considerable pain at the beginning and that he had simply not mentioned. "Good news?" he said. "He's coming Thursday," she said, "and he already has a case file on Crow." Ethan set down the frame. "He knows who Crow is." "He knows who Crow is," she confirmed. Something moved across Ethan's face that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but was somewhere between the two. In the territory of a man who has spent 6 weeks believing that what happened to him was invisible to the world and has just received the first evidence that it wasn't. "My father's barn," he said. "I know," she said. He picked the frame back up and went back to work, which was what he did with things that mattered. Worked through them, alongside them, used his hands to manage what his voice couldn't. She picked up the ledger and updated the figures for the week, and tried not to think about Thursday with too much urgency, because urgency was how you made mistakes, and she could not afford mistakes. Not here, not now, not with this. Silas Crow made his first direct move on a Wednesday. He did not come to the ranch himself. He sent the lawyer, Hatch, and he sent him with a document that Hatch delivered to Orrin Webb at the land office, and Webb sent a notice to Ethan by courier. A boy of about 14 who arrived on horseback and handed over the folded paper with the look of someone who did not want to be associated with its contents. The document claimed that a filing error in the original Holloway land grant, dated 1868, invalidated the current title, and that under territorial law, the property had reverted to unregistered status, pending a county review. It named the Crow Land Syndicate as the interested party filing for first claim on the newly unregistered acreage. Rosalie read it standing in the yard while Ethan read it over her shoulder. When she finished, she handed it to him, and he read it again alone, and she watched his hands, both of them, even the left, tighten on the paper. "They're not waiting anymore," he said. "No," she said. "Crow saw me on the boardwalk and ran the calculation. He knows I know something. This is pressure." She took the document back and looked at the date. "They filed this Monday, 2 days ago. Before Greer even gets here. They're trying to get ahead of us," she said. "File first, force a response, use the response timeline against us." She folded the document. "It won't work, but we have to move carefully. What do we do?" She had been thinking about this since the moment she'd read the document. Actually, she'd been thinking about a version of this moment since the boardwalk. So in some sense, she'd had 3 days to think about it. And she had reached a conclusion that she had not fully let herself reach until this moment, when the paper in her hands made it not a precaution, but a necessity. "I'm going to send a telegram to Boston," she said. "Tonight." He looked at her. "Edmund Hale, my estate manager. I need him to authorize a specific transfer of funds to a Laramie bank account. Not a large amount. We don't need to use everything we have, and I don't want to give Crow a reason to escalate further than he already has." She paused. "But we need Greer properly retained. We need him to be able to move without financial constraint, and we need to be able to make the county review work for us instead of against us, which means having someone who can access the original land grant records in the Territorial Archive in Cheyenne." "That costs money." "Yes," she said. "It does." He was quiet. She watched him work through it. Not the money, she didn't think, because she believed him when he'd said he needed a day, and he'd come back and said, "Tell me what you need." She believed that was real. What he was working through was something else, the specific architecture of what they were doing, the size of it. "This isn't about our ranch anymore," he said. "It hasn't been since Walt Briggs," she said. "Maybe not since before that. We're going after him in a real way, legal way. Across, you said 3 counties, maybe more." That's what Greer's letter suggests, yes. "And when Crow figures out what we're actually doing, he'll respond harder," she said. "I know that." He looked at her. In the late afternoon light, the damage on his face was more visible, and she looked at it the way she always did now, without adjustment. "Are you scared?" he said. The question surprised her. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it was the first time he'd asked her something that direct about something that internal. "Yes," she said. "I'm scared. I'd have to be an idiot not to be." "But you're still doing it." "I'm scared of Crow," she said. "I am more scared of what happens if we do nothing." He held her gaze. "Then we go to the telegraph office tonight," he said. They went. The telegram to Edmund Hale was 19 words, which was what she could afford at the telegraph rate, and she had chosen those 19 words with the economy of a woman who had learned that precision was more powerful than length. Edmund Hale, who had worked for her family for 11 years and who had, on 2 separate prior occasions, executed instructions from Rosalie that had surprised him and that had proven, in both cases, to have been exactly right, would understand what she was asking and would move on it within 48 hours. She handed the telegram over the counter and paid for it and walked out onto the boardwalk with Ethan beside her. Down the street, the light in the land office was still on. She looked at it for a moment. "Tomorrow I want to go back through everything Walt gave us," she said. "And I want to talk to the Caldwell family before Greer arrives. If his case file connects to Crow, we should walk in Thursday with as complete a picture as we can build." "The Caldwells are private people," Ethan said. "Ansel Caldwell is going to want to know why we're asking." "Then we tell him the truth," she said. "Or enough of it." "How much is enough?" She thought about it. "Enough that he knows we're not working for Crow." Ethan nodded slowly. "He'll talk if he believes that. He's been angry about the boundary dispute since spring. He just didn't have anywhere to take it." "He does now," she said. They walked back toward the ranch in the early dark, and the stars were coming out above them in that Wyoming way that was still, even now, something she had not gotten used to. Too many of them. Too bright. The sky opened up in a way that Boston never permitted. She had stopped being surprised by it and started just seeing it, which she thought was probably what happened when a place became yours rather than somewhere you were visiting. She thought about that, the word yours, and about the house walls they'd built, and about Ethan's letters for 8 months, and about the leather case and what it had cost her to say the things she'd said at the fire ring. She thought about Thursday and Greer and the case file and the name Crow appearing in it 18 months ago. She thought about a forged document with a notary stamp, S. Dillard, Cheyenne, and about the fact that forged documents implied a network, implied other people, implied that Crow was not operating alone, and that when they pulled on this thread, what they found underneath would be larger and messier and more dangerous than a land broker and a crooked lawyer in a frontier town. She thought about all of this and kept walking, and beside her Ethan walked in his particular steadiness that was not the steadiness of a man who wasn't afraid, but the steadiness of a man who had already made his decision and was simply moving toward it. At the gate to the ranch he stopped, and she stopped with him. "I was looking at this house, the walls they'd built. The east wall with its new window frame, pale wood against the charred ground that was slowly, field by field, coming back to something alive. When Greer comes," he said, "and when this is all in front of him, whatever happens after, I want you to know something." She waited. "I would have asked you to stay anyway," he said, "before I knew about any of it. I would have figured out a way to ask you to stay." She looked at the house, looked at him. "I know," she said. "I was waiting for you to figure it out." He made a sound that was more of a laugh this time, a real one, brief and a little rough, like something that hadn't been used in a while and needed to loosen up. She smiled, not at him, but at the house, because it was easier. They went inside. Tomorrow there was work to do, and Thursday was coming fast, and somewhere in the land office down the road a light had just gone off, and a man named Crow was making calculations that he believed were already complete. He was wrong. He didn't know it yet, but he was wrong. Thomas Greer arrived on Thursday afternoon, not the morning she'd hoped for, and he arrived looking like a man who had ridden hard and slept poorly and had opinions about both of those things that he was choosing not to express because he had more important opinions waiting. He was older than Rosalie had expected from the retired judge's description, closer to 60 than 50, with the kind of face that had been lived in thoroughly and showed it. His coat was good quality but had seen several years of hard use, and he carried a leather satchel that was so full it didn't close properly and had a piece of twine tied around it to compensate, which told her something about the volume of material he'd brought without anyone asking him to. He shook her hand first, which she noted. Then Ethan's. "Your letter," he said to Rosalie, setting the satchel on the crate outside the shed like it was a piece of furniture he intended to use, was the most organized account of a fraud pattern I have received in 30 years of practice. I say that as a compliment. I also say it as a man who has been trying to close a gap in his own case for 18 months, and who read the name Dillard in your description and nearly fell off his chair. S. Dillard, she said, the notary stamp. Samuel Dillard. He is not a notary. He is a clerk who was dismissed from the Cheyenne Territorial Office in 1881 for altering a survey record, and he has been in Crow's employ, I believe, I could not prove it until your letter, since approximately 1882. He opened the satchel without untying the twine, just worked his hand in and extracted a folder. I have 17 cases across 3 counties. Families who lost land through what appeared to be individual legal disputes, but which, when you lay them side by side, show a coordination of timing and method that is not coincidental. Holloway's ranch wasn't a legal dispute, Ethan said. It was a fire. Greer looked at him. His expression did not change, but something in it sharpened. No, he said. It wasn't a legal dispute, which is why your case is different from the others, and why I am particularly interested in it. He looked at Rosalie. You said in your letter that the fire originated from the western edge of the property against the direction of the prevailing wind that day. That's what Ethan's witness confirmed, she said. A ranch hand named Cole Decker. He saw the smoke first. Is Decker still in the county? He found work at the Briggs property, Ethan said. After the fire, I couldn't keep him on. I need to speak with him, Greer said. Today, if possible. And I need access to every document you've collected. The Briggs survey discrepancy, the chain of homesteader letters, anything you have on Crow's movements in the county. Rosalie went inside and retrieved the ledger, the copied documents, and the notes she had organized over the previous 2 weeks, with the same systematic care she'd applied to the ranch accounts. She set them on the crate beside Greer's folder and watched him go through them with the focused speed of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for, which was both efficient and, she had to admit to herself, a small relief. She had not been entirely certain until this moment that what she'd built in her ledger would read as coherent to someone else, that what made sense to her in the accumulation of small details would hold together as a pattern under another person's professional scrutiny. It held. Greer looked up after 20 minutes. The Dillard stamp appears twice in what you have here. Combined with my 17 cases, I now have 8 confirmed instances of his seal. He paused. In Wyoming territory, a fraudulent notarial act is a criminal offense, not merely a civil one. That distinction matters significantly when we get to court. When, Ethan said, not if. He'd caught it. Greer looked at him. When, he confirmed. The question is not whether this case is prosecutable. The question is how quickly we can build it to a standard that survives Crow's resources. Because I should tell you plainly, the Crow Land Syndicate has money behind it. Real money. There is a parent organization, I believe, operating out of Denver, and they have retained legal counsel that is considerably better funded than I am. That won't be a problem, Rosalie said. Both men looked at her. She looked at Greer steadily. I wrote you an honest account of the fraud pattern because I wanted you to take this case on its merits. I did not mention in my letter that I have the financial means to retain you properly and to fund the investigation that this case requires. She paused. I'm mentioning it now. The Mercer estate, out of Boston. I have authorized a transfer to a Laramie account that you can draw on for case expenses. I would like a full accounting of every expenditure, and I would like weekly reports. Greer was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the evaluating expression of a man recalibrating a situation he thought he'd understood. You came to Dry Creek as a mail-order bride, he said, and it wasn't an accusation, just the observation of a man who was putting pieces in their proper order. I came to Dry Creek because I wrote Ethan Holloway 47 letters and found him to be an honest man, she said. Everything else is context. Greer looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing, which in the context of Ethan Holloway said quite a lot. Greer picked up his folder. I'll need to speak with Decker and the Caldwells today. Tomorrow I want to go to the Territorial Archive in Cheyenne. I'll need 2 days there. When I come back, we build the case formally and set a court date. He looked at Rosalie. In the meantime, do not respond to the county review notice that was filed Monday. Do not sign anything. If Hatch or anyone connected to Crow contacts you directly, you send them to me. Crow himself may contact us, she said, He knows I'm here. He's aware something is shifting. If Crow contacts you personally, Greer said, and his voice had a particular quality now that was the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time for something. Write down every word he says. Cole Decker was 23 years old, built like a man who had grown up doing work that didn't pause for weather, and he was the kind of person who looked uncomfortable the moment he stopped moving. He stood in the Briggs yard with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the middle distance while Greer asked him questions, and he answered each one the same way. Short, direct, no embellishment, the sentences of a person who hadn't been asked to tell this story before and was taking care with it because he understood that care was what was required. Western pasture, he said. I was coming down from the north fence when I saw it. First smoke was low, real low, like something at ground level, not a lightning strike. Lightning hits high. This was low. What time? Greer asked. Just after 4 in the morning, early light. I could see the ground. Had there been a storm the night before? Dry lightning 2 nights before, Decker said. But nothing the night before the fire. Sky was clear. I know because I'd been up late fixing a fence post on the north line, and I was outside until close to midnight. And the wind that morning? Decker looked at Ethan. East wind, he said. It was an east wind, Mr. Holloway. I remember because I thought about it after. If a fire starts in a west wind and moves east, that makes sense. But an east wind and a fire that started in the west corner, he stopped. That fire was moving against the wind for the first 10 minutes, until it found the barn and got big enough to make its own weather. The yard was quiet. Greer was writing. He wrote for a moment after Decker stopped talking, and then he looked up. Would you be willing to say this in court, under oath, in front of a judge, and whatever counsel Crow brings? Decker looked at him for a long moment. He was 23, and Rosalie could see him doing the arithmetic. What it costs a man his age with a new job and no particular standing in a county to put himself against someone with money and a legal organization behind him. I'll say what I saw, Decker said. I saw what I saw. I'm not going to say something different because it's inconvenient. That's all I'm asking, Greer said. Decker put his hat back on. He looked at Ethan one more time. I'm sorry about the ranch, Mr. Holloway. The barn especially. I know what that barn was. Ethan nodded once, and that was all, and Decker went back to work. Greer left for Cheyenne the next morning. Rosalie stood at the fence and watched him go and then turned back to the house and the work that still needed doing because the case was in motion now, but the roof was not going to put itself on, and there was still winter to prepare for. The 2 days Greer was gone were the hardest days she'd had since the first week. Not because of Crow, not directly. No one came to the ranch. No more notices arrived. The county seemed to be holding its breath in the way that places sometimes do when something significant is in motion, and the various participants are waiting to see who moves first. The hard days were hard because of Ethan, not dramatically, not in a way she could easily name or write in a ledger. It was more that the conversation at the fire ring, the things she'd finally said about the money and why she'd waited to say them, had opened something that couldn't be carefully managed back into place. They were more honest with each other now, and more honesty between two people doing physical labor together in close quarters in a shed with a curtain between their sleeping spaces was, it turned out, both better and harder than the earlier careful distance had been. She noticed things. He was left-handed, had been, before the fire. She figured this out by watching which side he instinctively reached from before he caught himself and compensated. It meant the damage to his left hand was a specific loss that went beyond function into something more personal, a change in the fundamental grammar of how he moved through the world. He had not said this. He would not say this. But she watched him adjust, again and again, the 100 small moments in a day when a person's dominant hand is the one they reach with first, and she thought about what it cost him to rebuild every one of those habits from scratch. And she did not say anything about it because he hadn't offered it, and she had learned the specific etiquette of not pressing on things that were being managed. On the second evening, sitting at the fire ring with the sky going dark in that enormous Wyoming way, he said, without preamble, I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting someone to see you before they knew about the money. She looked up from the ledger. I understand it, he said. I didn't at first. I thought it was a kind of test which bothered me. But that's not what it was. No, she said. It was protection, he said. You'd been hurt by it before. She was quiet for a moment. A man named Frederick, in Boston. We were... It was some years ago. He found out about the estate before I'd intended him to. He didn't leave. That was almost worse. He stayed and he looked at me differently from that point forward, and I could not make him stop, no matter what I did, because it was inside him somewhere, and it came out in small ways, in the way he talked about our future, in the assumptions he made. She paused. I left. It was the right decision, but it took me longer than it should have. Ethan was quiet, looking at the fire. I don't know how to promise I won't do the same thing, he said. I don't know how a person proves that in advance. They don't, she said. That's the point. You can't prove it in advance. You can only do it or not do it. And so far? She looked at him. So far, she said carefully, you are the same as you were before I told you. He looked back at the fire. I don't know what to do with what you have, he said. With the money. I want to be honest about that. I know we need it for Greer. I know it's what makes this possible. But there is something in me that... It's not resentment. I don't know the right word. Pride, she said. Maybe. Or maybe it's that your definition of what a man owes his own life is built around what he builds with his own hands, she said. And right now the hands are different than they were. He looked at her sharply. She held it. After a moment he looked away. Not with anger. She'd been ready for anger, and had decided she would not move from what she'd said even if it came, but with something that was more like the expression of a person who has been seen accurately and isn't sure yet whether that's a relief or an exposure. The hand is different, he said finally. Yes, it is. You've adapted, she said. You've been adapting since the first day I was here. I've watched you do it. It's slower than it was. Most things worth doing are slower than you want them to be, she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. You have an answer for everything. I really don't, she said. I have an answer for specific things, and I compensate for everything else with persistence. This time it was a real laugh, brief and low, and he shook his head and looked back at the fire, and the evening settled around them with the particular quality it had been developing over the past weeks, which was something between partnership and something else that neither of them had given a name to yet, because naming it would require deciding what to do about it, and they had enough to decide about already. Greer came back from Cheyenne on a Saturday, and he came back with two things: a box of documents from the Territorial Archive and an expression that Rosalie read, the moment he dismounted, as the expression of a man who has found what he went looking for and is now aware of the full weight of what it means. He spread the documents on the table inside the nearly finished house. They'd finished the interior enough to have a table and 3 chairs and a roof that mostly kept out the weather. And he talked for 40 minutes without stopping, which was the longest she'd heard him speak. The original Holloway land grant, dated 1868, was exactly as filed. The coordinates were clear. The boundaries were unambiguous. The document that Hatch had presented to the county review, claiming a filing error in the original grant, had been constructed by replacing 2 pages of the original with altered versions. The same handwriting, she said, or close enough that she'd missed it. But the Territorial Archive held the original surveyor's field notes, and the field notes contained a notation that could not be replicated without access to those notes, and the notation was absent from the document Hatch had filed. The forgery is provable, Greer said. Not just questionable. Provable. Rosalie looked at Ethan. He was looking at the documents with his arms crossed and the particular controlled stillness she had come to know as his version of a very strong feeling being very carefully managed. There's more, Greer said. In the archive, I found a pattern of altered survey records going back to 1880, 14 properties, 3 of them in this county. The alterations are consistent. Same technique, same category of error introduced, same timeline from alteration to legal claim filed. I cross-referenced them against my 17 cases. He paused. 11 of the 17 matched the archive alterations. 11, Rosalie said. The Crow Land Syndicate has been operating in this territory for at least 4 years, Greer said. What you two stumbled into is not a local scheme. It is an organized criminal operation with a documented history of at minimum 31 fraudulent claims across 3 counties, and I now believe there are further cases in Nebraska and Colorado that I have not yet examined. The table was quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the cleared field, their field, the one they'd dug out of ash, and the sound of it against the new walls was different from the sound it had made against the shed, more solid, more enclosed, more like the sound a house makes when it's finally becoming what it was supposed to be. "What do we do with this?" Ethan asked. "We file for an emergency injunction against the county review notice," Greer said. "That stops the clock on any action against your title. Simultaneously, we file a formal fraud complaint with the territorial court in Cheyenne, naming Crow, Hatch, and Dillard as parties, with all supporting documentation." He looked at Rosalie. "The Mercer funding will allow me to hire a courier to Nebraska and a separate investigator in Denver to begin pulling the Colorado records before Crow has a chance to move them." "He'll know we've been to Cheyenne," Rosalie said. "He has someone in the land office, or near it. He'll know what we pulled from the archive." "Yes," Greer said. "Which means we have approximately," he thought, 4 days before he instructs his Denver counsel to begin filing counter motions in the other counties. If we move before he can coordinate, we create a situation where he's responding on multiple fronts simultaneously. "We draw him out," Rosalie said. "We draw out his entire network," Greer said. "The goal is not just to protect this property. The goal is to collapse the organization so completely that it cannot be rebuilt elsewhere." She looked at the documents. She thought about Walt Briggs and the Caldwell family, and Cole Decker standing in the yard with his hat in his hand saying, "I saw what I saw." She thought about 14 properties in the archive, 11 matching cases, 31 fraudulent claims that she could already see would be more when the Nebraska records came in. She thought about families who had signed what they were told to sign because they didn't know any better. "Do it," she said. Greer looked at Ethan. "Do it," Ethan said. Greer began sorting his documents into specific piles with the precise movements of a man who had been waiting for this particular kind of yes for a long time. Crow moved faster than 4 days. He moved in 2. On Monday morning, a man Rosalie didn't recognize came to the ranch on horseback and asked to speak with Ethan Holloway. She was in the yard when he arrived. Ethan was on the east side of the house, and she called him before she said a word to the rider, because she had made a rule for herself after the boardwalk that she did not speak to anyone connected to this situation without Ethan present. The man's name, he said, was Garrett, and he represented Mr. Crow in a professional capacity. He did not say what capacity. He was polite in a way that was less about manners and more about efficiency, the politeness of a man who wanted this to go cleanly so he could report back that it had gone cleanly. He made an offer. Crow would withdraw the county review filing. He would compensate Ethan Holloway for damages sustained in the fire at a rate he named, which was not a small number but was not a number that reflected what had actually been lost, either in timber or in 11 years of a man's life built on that land. He would extend a goodwill gesture to the Briggs family and the Caldwell family, though the specifics were left deliberately vague. In exchange, all parties would agree to a mutual non-disclosure of the current dispute and would withdraw any and all legal representations currently in progress. Rosalie looked at the number. She looked at Garrett. "Is Mr. Crow present in Dry Creek currently?" she asked. "I'm not at liberty to say," Garrett said. "I see," she said. "Could you deliver a message to him?" "Of course." "Tell him," she said, "that we appreciate the gesture and that we'll need until Wednesday to consider it." Garrett nodded, tipped his hat, and left. Ethan waited until the horse was out of the gate. "We're not considering it." "No," she said. "We're not. But Wednesday gives Greer 2 more days." She was already walking toward the house. "And I need to write him a letter right now telling him Crow just showed us how scared he is." Ethan was half a step behind her. "He wouldn't offer to pay us off if he thought he was going to win." "No," she said, pushing through the door. "He wouldn't." She sat at the table and opened the ledger to a blank page. She'd run out of separate paper 2 days ago, and began to write. The letter was short. She told Greer about the offer, the number, the non-disclosure clause, and the timeline. She told him they were not accepting. She told him that the offer itself was, in her reading, a confirmation that Crow was aware his legal position was weaker than his previous actions had suggested, and that this was the moment to move, not to pause. She sealed it and handed it to Ethan. "Write it to Laramie," she said. "Today." He took the letter. He looked at her for a moment. That particular way he'd developed of looking at her, which was the look of a man who was still, in some ongoing process, figuring out what it was that he'd ended up with when she'd stepped off that stagecoach, and who was finding the answer more interesting than he'd anticipated. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question.
Mostly, she said. Some of the time I'm working it out as I go. He almost smiled. Almost. Good, he said. Me too. He rode to Laramie.
She went back to the Eastfield with a shovel and the specific anger of a woman who had been offered a number by a man who had burned a barn her partner's father had built over 3 summers, and she put that anger into the ground where it would do some good, because there was still work to do, and the work was still what kept everything else in motion. Greer's injunction was filed on Tuesday. The county clerk, Orrin Webb, who had, it turned out, been uneasy about the Crow filings from the beginning, but had not known what to do with that unease and had defaulted to processing what was brought to him, accepted the filing with a visible relief that Greer described to Rosalie afterward as the relief of a man who had wanted someone to tell him he was right to be uncomfortable. The territorial court in Cheyenne received the fraud complaint on Wednesday. On Thursday, a telegraph arrived from Greer at the Dry Creek office. Rosalie collected it from the clerk and read it standing at the counter. Denver Council notified territorial court intention to file counter motion. Expected. Court has accepted our documentation for review. Hearing scheduled 4 weeks out. Prepare your witnesses. Decker critical. Also, Nebraska confirms 3 matching cases. Total now 34. Come to Laramie when you can. We need to talk about what this becomes. She folded the telegram. The clerk, a young man who clearly wanted to ask what it said and was exercising considerable restraint not to, busied himself with reorganizing things on his desk. She thanked him and walked out. 4 weeks. A hearing. 34 cases. She stood on the boardwalk and looked down the street at the land office. The light was on again. It was always on. Someone in there was working, or pretending to, or waiting. She thought about Crow's offer, the number he'd sent through Garrett, the non-disclosure clause that would have sealed every affected family inside their silence. 34 families, possibly more. 12 years of organized fraud. A network that had survived this long because each individual case looked small enough to accept or absorb or simply give up on. She thought about what Greer had written, talk about what this becomes. She already knew what it needed to become. She'd known since the night Ethan had named the people, Caldwell, Peterson, Briggs, and she'd written them in her ledger and seen the shape of it. You did not fight this by defending one property. You fought it by making the entire structure visible. She walked back to the ranch. Ethan was on the roof, which was nearly complete, the last section of pitched roof that she had argued for, the steeper pitch, and which he had agreed to 3 days ago after a second look at the numbers and a brief, characteristic silence that meant he had recalculated and reached the same conclusion she had, and he looked down when he heard her come through the gate. "Telegram from Greer," she called up. "Good or bad?" "Complicated," she said. "Come down when you can. I need to tell you what comes next." He came down. She told him. He sat on the bottom rung of the ladder for a moment after, thinking. His left hand was resting on his knee in the open position he used when he was working something through, not the tucked-away position he used when he was managing pain or self-consciousness. She had learned the difference. 4 weeks, he said. 4 weeks. And then a courtroom. Yes. He looked at the roof, at the walls they'd built, at the cleared field beyond them where the first new grass was coming in, real grass, not the ash-gray nothing that had been there when she'd arrived, but actual green, faint and sparse but present, the ground deciding to try again. "Then we'd better be ready," he said. "We will be," she said. She meant it. And the thing about Rosalie Mercer was that when she said a thing like that, it wasn't optimism, it wasn't bravado, it was simply an accurate assessment of what she was going to do between now and then, which was the same thing she'd been doing since she stepped off the stagecoach into the smell of old smoke and found a man at a water barrel and decided that burned ground was still ground, and ground could grow things if you were willing to put in the work. She looked at the new grass. 4 weeks. She went inside to start making a list. The 4 weeks between the telegram and the hearing were the kind of weeks that don't feel like weeks at all. They feel like a single long day that keeps resetting at midnight without letting you sleep. Rosalie made her list, and then she made a second list, and then she reorganized both lists into something that Greer, when he came back from Laramie 8 days before the hearing, looked at for 6 minutes in silence before saying it was the most complete pretrial evidence organization he had seen in a career that had included 2 major land fraud cases and 1 railroad corruption matter in 1877, that he still occasionally cited as the most complicated thing he'd ever argued. She accepted this without comment and asked him what was missing. He told her 3 things. She had 2 of them already and spent the next 4 days acquiring the third, which required 3 letters, a telegram, and a conversation with the retired Circuit Judge Calloway, who had passed back through Dry Creek on his way north, and who, when Rosalie explained what she needed, had given her a name in Cheyenne who could access a specific category of territorial telegraph records that were technically public but practically inaccessible without knowing they existed. The name was a records clerk named Augusta Finn, who was 57 years old, had been in her position for 19 years, and who received Rosalie's letter with the attention it deserved, and responded within 48 hours with a certified copy of 11 telegraph communications sent from a Cheyenne office to a Denver address between January and August of the current year. The Denver address belonged to the parent organization of the Crow Land Syndicate. The communications detailed, in the abbreviated language of telegraph correspondence, a coordinated sequence of property acquisition targets, legal pressure timelines, and, in one message dated 6 weeks before the Holloway fire, an instruction to accelerate the Western Holloway matter by alternative means given resistance to standard approach. Rosalie read that line 4 times. Then she took the certified copy to Greer, who read it once and set it down on the table with the deliberate care of a man placing something fragile, and said, "This is it." "I know," she said. "This connects the fire directly to the syndicate's instructions." "I know." He looked at her. "How did you know to look for telegraph records?" "Because Crow is not a man who operates locally," she said. "He takes direction. He reports back. That kind of operation runs on communication, and communication in this territory runs on telegraph. I just needed to know which office and which timeline." Greer was quiet for a moment. "Miss Mercer, I have practiced law in this territory for 30 years. I want you to know that I mean this sincerely and not as flattery. You should have been an attorney." She looked at the certified copy. She thought about Boston and her mother's ledgers and the boardrooms where she'd been the only woman who stayed for the entire meeting and the men who had been surprised every time that she already knew what they were going to tell her. "I thought about it," she said, "but the bar doesn't take women in Wyoming yet." "No," he said, "it doesn't." "So I work with the tools I have," she said, "which is what everyone does." She picked up the certified copy and added it to the file. Ethan had been preparing in his own way, which was less about documents and more about the particular labor of deciding what you were willing to say out loud in a room full of people who had already formed opinions about you. He had never been a man who liked being looked at. Before the fire, this had been a manageable preference. Ranchers didn't spend much time in public rooms, didn't need to present themselves, didn't need to convince anyone of anything except through the evidence of their land and their livestock and the straightness of their fences. After the fire, the scarred face had made being looked at into something that required active effort, a daily decision to go into town, to speak to people, to stand in the general store and wait for Fletcher to count out change, while whoever was at the counter processed what they were looking at. He had managed. He had made the decision to manage it, the morning after the fire when he'd first seen his own reflection in the water barrel and had stood there for a long moment before deciding that the alternative to managing it was not an acceptable option, and that had been, as far as decisions went, about as settled as it ever got. But a courtroom was different. A courtroom was a room where you were specifically the object of attention, where your face and your hands and your history were all, in some sense, evidence, where the damage was not just something to be looked past, but something that would be present in every juror's assessment of what you were saying and whether to believe it. He did not say any of this to Rosalie directly, but she knew. She had learned the specific grammar of the things he didn't say, the way his left hand moved, the evenings he was quieter than usual, the moments when she'd look up from the ledger and find him sitting with his eyes on the fire in the not-seen way that meant he was somewhere internal. She said one evening, 9 days before the hearing, "You know what's going to happen in that courtroom." He looked up. "The defense is going to use your face," she said. "Crow's attorney is going to imply that a man who survived a fire and lost everything might have a personal interest in assigning blame that doesn't reflect the facts. They're going to try to make your testimony about your injuries rather than about what happened." He looked at her steadily. "I know. And you're going to sit there and let them try," she said,
Because the moment you react, they've won the frame. The moment you get angry or defensive or anything, they get to say the testimony is emotional rather than factual. I know that too, he said. So I'm not telling you something you don't know, she said. She stopped. She looked at the ledger. I'm saying I know what it's going to cost you to do that, to sit there and take it, and not move. He was quiet for a moment. The fire took things I can replace, he said. The barn, the house, the cattle, all of that. It's hard, but it's replaceable, given time. He looked at his left hand. Some of it's already being replaced, but there are things it took that... He stopped. My father's barn. 23 years in this county. The reputation of being a man who built something that lasted. He paused. Crow took the evidence that I was capable of doing this. And when I walk into that courtroom, I need people to look at me and not see a burned man with nothing left. I need them to see a man who built something and had it taken. Rosalie looked at him. That's exactly what they'll see, she said, because that's what's true. And the truth has the advantage of being consistent. You don't have to remember it or maintain it. It's just what happened. He nodded once, the small, settled kind of nod. I know, he said. I just needed to say it out loud. I know, she said. They sat at the fire ring in the dark, and the house was behind them with its finished roof and its 4 solid walls and its east-facing kitchen window that caught the morning light in a way that Rosalie had not told him she had noticed and thought about. And the field beyond it was coming back green in the places they'd worked hardest, and the Wyoming night was doing its enormous thing above them, and neither of them felt the need to fill it with anything else. The morning of the hearing, Rosalie wore the best dress she had brought from Boston, which was dark blue wool, and had not been designed for Wyoming weather or Wyoming courtrooms, but which she had kept pressed and clean because she had known, from the moment she'd read Greer's first letter, that there would be a day when she would need to walk into a public room and be taken seriously at first glance by people who were going to make assumptions, and that the dress was one of the tools available to her for managing those assumptions. She was not above using every tool available. Ethan wore his good shirt and his good coat and had shaved with particular care, and she looked at him when he came out of the house and thought that whatever the courtroom saw, what she saw was a man who had gotten up every morning for 4 weeks and worked and prepared and not flinched, and that was its own kind of information about a person. Ready? She said. No, he said. Let's go anyway. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. The Laramie Courthouse was a substantial building for the territory, 2 stories of brick that had been built with the particular self-consciousness of a place that wanted to announce itself as permanent. The courtroom on the 2nd floor was full when they arrived, which surprised Rosalie until she understood why. Word had traveled, not through newspapers. Greer had been careful about that, careful about not giving Crow's counsel a public narrative to work against before the proceedings began. But the county was not large, and the people in it who had been affected by the syndicate's operations, who had received lawyers' letters and signed documents they hadn't understood and sold land they hadn't wanted to sell, those people had a network that operated faster and more thoroughly than any newspaper. The Caldwells were there. Walt Briggs, in his good coat, sitting with his wife. 2 other families she didn't recognize, but whose expressions, a particular combination of anger held carefully in check and the fragile alertness of people who had come somewhere, hoping to finally hear something that vindicated what they'd known privately for months, told her enough. Cole Decker was in the 2nd row, hat in his lap, back straight. And in the far left section of the gallery, 6 people she did not recognize who carried themselves with the particular stillness of people from a distance. Nebraska, she thought. The people Greer's investigator had contacted. They had come, which told her something about what the syndicate had cost them. That they had ridden or taken the train to a Wyoming courthouse to watch a proceeding that was not technically their own. Silas Crow was already seated at the defendant's table with his attorney, a man named Porter, who had come from Denver, and who had the expensive, unhurried quality of a lawyer who was accustomed to winning by resource attrition rather than by argument. Crow himself was composed, which she'd expected. He wore the same calibrated frontier presentation, good coat, practical cut, and he looked at her when she walked in with the expression of a man who had revised his assessment of a situation several times and had settled into a kind of careful neutrality that was, she knew,
its own form of strategy. She looked back at him without expression and sat down. Greer, beside her, opened his satchel and began arranging his documents with the focused calm of a man for whom a courtroom was native terrain. "Porter is going to lead with the procedural argument," Greer said quietly. "He'll claim the fraud complaint was filed improperly, that the county review was a legitimate administrative process, that we're attempting to conflate a civil property dispute with a criminal matter. It's going to sound reasonable for about 20 minutes. "And then?" Ethan said. "And then I introduced the archive documents," Greer said, "and it stopped sounding reasonable." The judge was a man named Aldous Kemp, who had been on the territorial bench for 8 years and who had, according to the retired Judge Calloway, a particular intolerance for elaborate deceptions combined with a fairly limited patience for lawyers who talk too long. He entered the room, and the room stood and sat, and he looked at the gallery with the expression of a man who had not expected this many people and was already incorporating it into whatever framework he used to understand what a case was actually about. Porter argued for 22 minutes. He was good at it, precise, structurally sound, using language that made the syndicate's operations sound like an administrative function that had been mischaracterized by inexperienced parties. He referred to Ethan twice as Mr. Holloway, who understandably has strong feelings about his situation. Both times, Ethan sat without moving. Rosalie watched Crow while Porter talked. Crow watched the judge. He was reading Kemp the same way she was reading Crow, and she thought, he's done this before. He sat in rooms like this and watched the judge and made his calculations and walked out. He had walked out because the cases against him had always been individual. One family, one property, one set of documents that were complex enough, and the plaintiff poor enough and isolated enough that the cost of continuing had always exceeded the cost of settling or giving up. He had not been in a room with 34 families' worth of documents before. She had made sure of that. When Greer stood up, he did not begin with argument. He began with the archive documents. He presented them one at a time in chronological order, beginning in 1880. Each one entered into the record with its corresponding case, the family, the property, the fraudulent claim that had followed. He did it with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the architecture of what he was presenting needed to be built piece by piece so that the full shape of it could not be dismissed or reduced. By the time he reached the 11th document, Porter had objected 4 times. Judge Kemp had sustained none of them. By the time Greer reached the certified telegraph communications, the ones from Augusta Finn, the ones detailing the coordinated sequence of acquisitions, and in that one message, the instruction to accelerate the Western Holloway matter by alternative means. The courtroom was so quiet that Rosalie could hear the man behind her breathing. Crow's composure broke on the telegraph evidence. Not dramatically, it was not the moment of theatrical collapse that she had, in some imagined version of this day, half expected. It was smaller than that and more revealing. It was the moment when his eyes, which had been on the judge, moved involuntarily to the certified copy in Greer's hands, and stayed there for 3 seconds longer than was strategically wise. And in those 3 seconds, his expression showed something that was not neutrality and was not calm and was not the composed confidence of a man who believed his position was secure. 3 seconds. Then he looked back at the judge. But she had seen it. Porter asked for a recess. Kemp gave him 15 minutes. During the recess, Rosalie did not speak. She sat at the table and looked at her hands that had been blistered and wrapped in strips of old shirt, and that had, over the past months, built up the particular kind of calluses that come from work that doesn't accommodate gentleness. And she thought about the telegraph communication and the word alternative means and what those words had actually meant, which was fire, which was the barn Ethan's father had spent 3 summers building, which was the scarred face across the table from her at the fire ring every evening, which was a man at a water barrel with his back turned saying, "You need to get back on the next stagecoach," because he thought there was nothing left worth staying for. She thought about what she would say to the woman she'd been on that stagecoach 4 months ago, reading Ethan's letter for the 100th time with her hands around it. She thought she would say, "Stay. Stay exactly the way you plan to. It is going to be harder than you think, and it is going to matter more than you know. And the thing you find at the end of it is not what you came looking for, but it is better, and it is real, and it will be yours in a way that nothing arranged or easy could ever be." The recess ended. Porter's counter-argument was technically competent and substantially undermined. He challenged the admissibility of the telegraph records on procedural grounds. Greer had anticipated this and had a prior ruling from the territorial court establishing the evidentiary standard. He challenged the relevance of the archive documents to the specific Holloway claim. Greer introduced the pattern evidence, and Kemp allowed it. He tried, twice, to redirect toward Ethan's state of mind and the emotional context of the testimony. Kemp cut him off the second time with a brevity that suggested his patience had reached its limit. Cole Decker testified for 11 minutes. He said what he'd seen, in the same short sentences he'd used in the Briggs yard. And when Porter cross-examined him and suggested his recollection of the wind direction might be affected by the distress of the event, Decker looked at him with the calm of a 23-year-old who had made a decision about what he was willing to say and was not going to be moved from it. "I know which way the wind was blowing," Decker said. "I grew up in this county. I know east wind. It was east wind. The fire started in the west corner. That's what I saw." Porter moved on. Walt Briggs testified about the forged survey documents. He had brought his original filing and the Hatch document and laid them side by side on the evidence table, and even people in the gallery who knew nothing about survey notation could see the difference in the coordinates because Rosalie had, in the weeks of preparation, prepared a clear written comparison that Greer introduced as a demonstrative exhibit, which meant that every person in the room was looking at the same simple table showing what the original said and what the forgery claimed and the specific numbers that differed between them. Simplicity was its own argument. She had learned that in Boston boardrooms. When the facts are on your side, don't dress them up. Let them stand there plainly and make people look at them. The hearing ran for 6 hours. At the end of it, Judge Kemp did not deliver his ruling immediately. He said he would need 3 days to review the complete record, which was standard, which Greer had prepared them for. But what he said before he dismissed the court was not standard, or at least it was not standard in Rosalie's experience, and from the way Greer's expression shifted, she thought it might not be standard in his either. Kemp looked at the gallery, all of it, the Caldwells, and Walt Briggs, and the Nebraska families, and Cole Decker, and the people she didn't know who had come because word had traveled. And he said, "This court is aware that the matter before it today represents a pattern of conduct that extends beyond the specific claim under review. I want the parties to understand that the scope of this proceeding will be interpreted accordingly." He stood. The court stood. He left. Rosalie sat for a moment after, her hands flat on the table, while the room began to move around her. Greer said quietly, "That's as close as Kemp gets to telling you he's already made up his mind." She looked at him. "Is that good?" "In 30 years, he said, "I have never heard him say anything like that from the bench before a ruling." He began gathering his documents. "Yes, that's good, but..." The ruling came in 2 days, not 3. Kemp ruled the county review filing invalid on the grounds of fraudulent documentation. He ruled the Holloway land grant legally intact and binding. He referred the criminal fraud matter, the telegraph evidence, the Dillard forgeries, the coordinated pattern across 3 counties, to the territorial prosecutor's office with a written recommendation for full investigation. He also did something that neither Greer nor Rosalie had specifically requested, which was to issue a public notice of the ruling's findings in the territorial record, making the documentation of the syndicate's methods available to any county clerk or land office official who wished to review them. That notice was the piece that mattered most in the long run, though Rosalie didn't fully understand that until later. What happened next happened in stages, the way things that are actually significant usually happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in an accumulation of smaller ones that only look inevitable in retrospect. Crow's Denver counsel filed a motion to appeal. The motion was denied within 2 weeks on grounds that the evidentiary record was too complete to challenge on procedural terms. Crow himself was indicted by the territorial prosecutor's office 6 weeks after the hearing on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and share with the telegraph evidence establishing the alternative means instruction, criminal conspiracy to commit arson. Hatch was indicted on forgery charges. Dillard, the false notary, surrendered himself to authorities in Cheyenne before the indictment came through, apparently having decided that cooperating was preferable to whatever the alternative was. And his cooperation produced 3 additional names in the Denver parent organization that the territorial prosecutor had not previously had. The Crow Land Syndicate did not close gracefully. It unraveled in the way that organizations built on sustained deception tend to unravel, messily, with each piece of the structure implicating the next, the threads pulling loose in multiple directions simultaneously until there was nothing holding the center together. The Peterson family, who had sold and left the county 2 years earlier believing their title was defective, were notified that the documentation used to pressure their sale had been forged and that they had legal grounds for recovery of damages. 2 of the Nebraska families received similar notifications. The Caldwells had their boundary dispute officially resolved in their favor. Walt Briggs, when Rosalie told him, sat at his kitchen table for a moment with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and then said, "I should have fought it from the beginning." "You didn't know," she said. "No," he said. "But I should have." "Walt," she said. "You signed nothing. You held. That's what mattered." He looked at her. "You held for all of us." She didn't answer that because she didn't know how to answer it accurately without either being falsely modest or claiming something that wasn't entirely hers to claim. What she said was, "Greer held the legal argument. Decker told the truth. You kept your documents. Everyone did their part." "And you organized all the parts," he said. She picked up her coffee. "I organized all the parts," she agreed. The house was finished in October, which was later than she'd hoped, and earlier than she'd feared, which was roughly how the whole summer had gone. The roof held its pitch. The east wall had its window. The kitchen, which Rosalie had designed with the particular attention of a woman who had spent months cooking over an open fire ring and had developed strong opinions as a result, had a proper stove that Ethan had gone to Cheyenne to collect, and had driven back on a wagon that had taken a full day and a half each way. The night they slept in the house for the first time, in actual rooms with an actual wall between them instead of a curtain, was strangely quiet. Not uncomfortable, quiet in the way that something newly built is quiet, still settling into itself, not yet carrying the sounds of habitual life. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about the stagecoach and the smell of old smoke and a woman at the post office saying honey with an expression that combined pity and judgment, and she thought about how much had happened since then and how little of it she had anticipated, and how most of the things she hadn't anticipated had turned out to be the things that mattered. She was not a romantic about this. She was not going to pretend that the months had been anything other than exhausting and frightening at intervals and physically harder than anything she'd done before. The blisters had become calluses, and the calluses had cracked in the dry air, and she had wrapped them in salve and kept working, and there had been evenings when she was tired in a way she didn't have a word for, and she had sat at the fire ring and thought, why is this what I chose when I could have stayed in Boston and lived comfortably and been fine? But fine was not what she'd come looking for. She'd known that before she ever placed the advertisement. She'd known it the way you know things that aren't entirely rational, that resist being organized into a ledger. She'd known it in the particular emptiness of her mother's house after the estate was settled, and the lawyer had left, and she was standing in a room that had always been full of someone else's life, and was now just full of her own absence. She had come looking for something that needed her. She had found 40 acres of burned ground and a man who'd told her to leave and meant it and had been completely wrong. In the next room, she heard Ethan shift on his cot. They had not yet replaced the furniture. That was Winter's project. And the house settled around the sound, and outside the Wyoming night was doing its thing, enormous and cold, and not particularly interested in any of this, which she found, oddly, comforting. The indifference of the land was its own kind of honesty. It didn't care if you stayed or left. It didn't reward sentiment. It rewarded presence and work, and the decision to stay when the sensible calculation said otherwise. She thought she could live with those terms. He asked her at the end of October, which was not when she'd expected him to ask, and was also exactly when she should have expected it, because Ethan Holloway did things when they were ready and not before, and the things he did when they were ready tended to be done without preamble and without performance, and with the direct honesty that had been in his letters from the beginning. They were at the fire ring. They still ate outside sometimes, out of habit, out of the particular attachment to something that had been theirs before the house was finished. And the evening was cold enough that they were both in heavy coats, and the coffee was more of a necessity than a comfort. He said, "I'd like to marry you." She looked at him across the coals. "I know the timing isn't arranged," he said. "I know it's not what you expected when you answered my letters, and I know—" He stopped, started again. "I know I'm not what you would have gotten if things had gone the way I said they would. The ranch I described in those letters was bigger than this. The situation was more settled. I said things about what I could offer that, Ethan, she said. He stopped. The letters were honest, she said. The ranch changed. You didn't. He was quiet. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again, plainly. I'll marry you. He nodded. The small, settled nod. She had learned to read it by now. It was not a minimal response. It was a complete one. It was what he used when something had resolved into exactly what it should be, and the appropriate response to that was acknowledgement, not expansion. They sat at the fire ring in the cold evening, and after a while he said, I never thought I'd rebuild this place. I know. When you arrived? He stopped. I told you to leave because I believed there was nothing here worth staying for. I know that too. I was wrong about that, he said. Yes, she said. You were. He almost smiled, the half expression that she had catalogued over 4 months, and that she thought now she would probably spend a long time continuing to learn. You're not going to tell me I was understandably wrong given the circumstances, he said. You're not going to soften it. You were wrong, she said. You know it, and I know it, and there's no useful purpose in softening it. There was something worth staying for. There still is. He looked at the fire. Yeah, he said, there is. They married in November, inside the house, in the room that would become the front room once the furniture arrived, with Martha as witness and Greer, who had come down from Laramie on unrelated business and had stayed when he heard, standing near the window with the particular expression of a man who had spent 30 years in courtrooms and occasionally forgot that the cases he worked on were also people's lives. Walt Briggs came. Cole Decker came, hat in hand, and stood in the back and looked like he wasn't sure if he'd been invited and had come anyway, which was exactly the kind of thing that Rosalie respected without saying so. There was no ceremony to speak of, because neither of them wanted one. There was a justice of the peace, who was a practical man and moved through it efficiently. And when it was done, and the room felt the same and also different, the way rooms do. Greer shook Ethan's hand and said, You found the right one. Ethan looked at Rosalie and said, I know. Martha cried a little and didn't apologize for it, which Rosalie also respected. Walt Briggs brought a bottle of something that he said was rye, and that tasted less specifically like rye than like something homemade that had been stored in a rye bottle, but everyone drank it, and no one said anything about it. And the room was warm, and outside the first serious snow of the season was beginning to come down and covering the cleared field and the new grass in white that would hold until spring. The Holloway Frontier Center was Rosalie's idea, and like most of Rosalie's ideas, it arrived fully formed and practical rather than vague and aspirational. She presented it to Ethan in January, which was the quietest month on the ranch, and therefore the month when ideas that required extended discussion had the best chance of getting the attention they deserved. She laid it out as she would have laid out a financial proposal: what it was, what it required, what it would provide, what the realistic timeline looked like. And she watched him listen to it with the focused attention he brought to things he was taking seriously. A center, on their property. Not large, not to begin with. A building, staffed by people who knew the law, who knew medicine in the basic sense, who could help a homesteader understand a document before they signed it, or identify when a title dispute was legitimate versus when they were being worked. Greer, she said. He's agreed to come down twice a month. He said he'd do it for travel expenses only, which tells you what he actually thinks about the state of things in this county. And the funding? Us, she said. To start. If it grows past what we can support, we look for other sources. But we don't start by asking. We start by doing it, and then we let the evidence of what it does speak for what it needs. Ethan looked at the wall, looked at the window, looked back at her. You have been thinking about this since the courtroom, he said. Since Walt Briggs's kitchen table, she said. He absorbed this. People are going to say it's charity, he said. People are going to say a lot of things, she said. They said I was naive for staying. They said you were too broken to deserve another chance. They've been wrong before. He looked at her for a long moment. How big a building? She told him. He nodded. We start in spring, he said, after the east fence is repaired and before the planting. Spring, she agreed. The center opened in June. It was not impressive to look at. A single-room building on the north edge of the property, with a table and chairs and a shelf of legal reference materials that Greer had assembled with characteristic thoroughness and no apparent concern for the expense. It had a sign outside, painted by Rosalie in the careful block letters she'd used in her ledgers. Because she was not an artist, but she was precise, and precision made a serviceable substitute. The first family came 3 days after it opened. A young couple from the eastern edge of the county, 22 years old, with a title dispute they'd been trying to understand for 2 months and no one to ask. They sat at the table and explained their situation to the clerk. Greer had sent down a young man named Morrison, who was reading for the bar and who had the earnest competence of someone at the beginning of a career they were going to be good at. And when they left 2 hours later, they had a written summary of their situation, a clear explanation of their rights, and a copy of the relevant territorial statute. They also had the particular expression of people who have been carrying something alone and have just discovered they don't have to. Rosalie watched them go from the kitchen window of the house, the east-facing window that caught the morning light, the one she had noticed months ago and not told Ethan she'd thought about. He came and stood beside her. 2 more families tomorrow, he said. Morrison told me. I know, she said. They stood at the window and watched the young couple ride out through the gate, and the field beyond them was green and growing in the June warmth. The same field they'd cleared by hand from ash and compacted clay, and the stubborn resistance of burned ground that hadn't been ready yet to give up what it still had in it. She thought about the stagecoach, about the smell of old smoke, about a decision made not because it was rational or safe or even particularly hopeful, but because she was 34 years old and had spent enough of her life waiting for conditions to be right and had decided that the conditions would never be right, and that the right thing to do with a life was to put it somewhere it could matter and let what came from that be what it was. What it was, it turned out, was this. Not perfect. Not without cost. The left hand that gripped things differently now, the winter nights when old arguments surfaced about how to spend what they had and on what timeline, the days when the land pushed back and the work was grinding and neither of them had much left for anything but necessary conversation. Real things, ongoing things, the texture of a life being actually lived rather than arranged. But also this, the green field, the house with its pitched roof, the building on the north edge of the property where 2 families a week were becoming 3, then 5, then more than the single table could comfortably hold, and plans being made for a second room. The look on Ethan's face in the early morning when he came out to the fire ring and the coffee was already made and the ledger was open and there was work to do. The particular quality of being in a place that needed you and knowing, past all the noise of doubt and difficulty, that you had been right to stay. The east fence needs looking at this week, Ethan said. I know, she said. I put it in the ledger. Of course you did, he said. She looked at him. He was looking out the window at the field, at the gate, at the road that went toward Dry Creek, and beyond it toward everything else, and his expression was the one she had learned over months of morning fire rings and arguments about roof pitch and evenings when the silence between them had slowly become the comfortable kind instead of the careful kind. He was, she thought, not the man she had imagined when she'd read his first letter. He was more difficult than that, and more complicated, and considerably less certain of himself than she'd expected, and more honest about that uncertainty than most people she'd known, with much less reason to be uncertain. He was a man who had been knocked down to almost nothing and had stayed on the ground longer than he wanted to admit, and had been, in the end, too stubborn and too honest to stay there. She had not come to Wyoming looking for him specifically. She had come looking for something real. She had found it. East fence, she said, after breakfast. After breakfast, he agreed. She turned from the window and went back to the ledger. Outside, the morning light came through the east-facing glass and lay itself across the table where she worked, and the field was green, and the building on the north edge had its sign out front. And in the county around them, there were families who knew there was somewhere to go before they lost everything, and somewhere behind the mountains to the west. The territory was changing in the slow way that territories change, not through single events, but through the accumulation of people who had decided that what was here was worth protecting. She opened the ledger to a new page. There was still work to do. There always would be, and she had long since made her peace with that, because she had come to understand that the work was not the obstacle between her and the life she wanted. The work was the life. She picked up her pen, and she began.